Miyuki Ishikawa. Miyuki Ishikawa was the demon midwife who murdered 100 babies. This evil woman terrorized Tokyo in the 1940s. She may have believed that she was acting out of mercy, but she was really just pure evil. She's actually considered one of history's deadliest female serial killers, if not the deadliest. We have to go back to just before World War II in Japan. Miyuki was working as a midwife, something that should have been a noble profession. It was actually fairly common for women at the time. But what nobody realized for way too long was that Miyuki was murdering the babies of poor families. When she was finally apprehended by police, she claimed that she did it because the families were too poor to raise the children. She didn't want them to suffer in financial poverty. This does make a bit of sense, though not to condone murders in the slightest. 1940s Japan was full of problems. There was food scarcity, the Allies kept bombing their train supplies, and famine was spreading across the country. People used to stand for hours in line just to get a single bowl of soup. Even after giving birth, many women went on to abandon their children or simply let them die in the cold from exposure. Miyuki's solution to this was to just kill the babies before they could ever experience such torment. The death toll was so high by the time she was caught that Miyuki remains the most prolific serial killer in the history of Japan. Her atrocities were even worse than anything committed by most of the soldiers throughout the whole war. Henry Louis Wallace. Henry Louis Wallace was a real piece of work. An American serial killer who murdered 10 young black women in North Carolina from between May of 1992 and March of 1994. He's considered one of the evilest serial killers in history, not because of how many he killed, but because of how awful the crimes truly were. Henry grew up with his mother, who worked long hours as a textile worker. He accused her of being too harsh on him, criticizing his every move and constantly disciplining him. After he graduated in 1983, he became a disc jockey, went to a few colleges, and then joined the US Navy in 1985. From here, he seemed to be a totally normal guy. He married his sweetheart from high school and was honorably discharged. But apparently, he had developed a drug problem in the Navy. He was smoking crack. When he got out, he began burglarizing houses around the Seattle area and was arrested in 1988 for robbing a hardware store. He served 2 years of probation and then started murdering in 1990. His first victim was Tashanda Bethea, a high school student. He brutally killed her and then dumped her body in a lake. He was questioned by the police, but they didn't have enough evidence to convict him. But it was in May of 1992 that the killing spree truly began. He hired a prostitute named Sharon Nance, then beat her to death when she demanded payment for her services, and dumped her body by the railroad tracks. This went on and on until he was finally caught after stabbing the co-worker of his girlfriend 38 times in the stomach. The reason Henry is considered so evil is that he killed for pleasure when he really had all he could ever ask for in life, including plenty of girlfriends. He just loved the thrill of the kill. King Herod. King Herod, often called Herod the Great, was the king of Judea between 74 and 4 BC. This was a time when Judea was heavily influenced by the Roman Empire, even though it was technically an independent kingdom. In the Bible, King Herod is depicted as a horrifying monster. The Bible says he tried to kill the baby Jesus, and when he couldn't find him, he butchered every last infant in Bethlehem. And even though historians today generally agree the story is fictitious, they also agree the real King Herod was a total dirtbag. Putting aside the story of Jesus, Herod really was a murdering psychopath. He executed one of his wives, he killed 3 of his children, and he had no less than 10 wives at a time. He was so crazy about having as many wives as possible that he tried to change the belief system around Judaism to say that it allowed polygamy. Anyone who didn't support his rule found themselves being confiscated of their property. He robbed the upper classes of the Jewish people until he became rich and powerful, able to pay for protection from his Roman overlords. And yet, despite his evil tendencies, Herod is still considered one of the greatest builders the Holy Land has ever seen. He built fortresses, amphitheaters, harbors, and rebuilt the Temple of Jerusalem after the Babylonians destroyed it. And in the end, He died an old man of natural causes. A life of evil, and then a quiet death. Joseph Stalin. Everyone hates Adolf Hitler. There's really no getting around it. But while Adolf Hitler is really the go-to standard for evil, Joseph Stalin was arguably just as bad. Stalin started out as a general secretary for the Communist Party in the 1920s, then became the dictator of the Soviet Union. He was one of the worst dictators the world has ever seen, particularly cruel and evil. Adolf Hitler may have killed at least 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. Vladimir Lenin, the guy who came right before Stalin, was responsible for 9 million deaths in his own country. But Joseph Stalin killed even more. Millions in the Soviet Union were executed, millions more starved to death because of his policies, and plenty more died in labor camps. Joseph Stalin was responsible for creating the Gulag system, which reached its heights in the 1950s with about 2.5 million inmates. Somewhere around 14 million passed in and out of the Gulag between 1934 and 1944 alone. He's also responsible for the Great Famine. Stalin switched Russia's policy from food production to industrialization, which caused a massive disaster. It's been estimated that 14.5 million people died from starvation just because of the switch. He basically shut off the food supply to his own people. In the end, Stalin's actions resulted in a disputed number of deaths, but probably somewhere around 20 million, mostly in the Soviet Union. Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez is evil incarnate. He is one of the most prolific serial killers in the world, a Colombian national convicted of murdering 110 individuals. However, he confessed to killing at least 350. And while you may think somebody like this would simply stay in prison for the rest of their life, he was actually released in the 1990s on good behavior. It was after that when authorities lost track of him. Nobody knows where he is today. Pedro Lopez, also known as the Monster of the Andes, is arguably one of the most dangerous demons on the planet and could be absolutely anywhere. His killings began around the 1970s. It's hard to say exactly when. All we know is that the Colombian made it his mission to travel across South America and murder as many young girls as possible. He made it to 100 by 1978. It was only when a flash flood in Ecuador revealed the buried bodies of 4 young girls that authorities finally caught on to what he was doing and tracked him down. When the police arrested him, he agreed to take them to one of his mass burial sites. There they found 53 of his victims. Mary Bell. In the 1960s, England had a child murderer living amongst them. It was just after the war was over. The small town of Scotswood was still recovering, and the streets were filled with unsupervised children, just kind of fending for themselves. One of these kids was Mary Bell, a young girl with a reputation for being unruly and explosively violent. Parents in the neighborhood had actually called the police because the young girl had tried to choke their children to death. By the age of 11, she had already killed 2 young boys with nothing but her hands, 4-year-old Martin Brown and 3-year-old Brian Howe. The way she killed them is so sick and disgusting, I can't even repeat it, or your ears might bleed. The only good thing about Mary Bell is that she was captured by authorities before she could kill any more kids. She was placed in a secure facility and spent 6 years there before being transferred to a different prison. At the age of 23, she was granted anonymity. She changed her name and she went into hiding. Mary Bell never killed again, not that we know about. She kept herself hidden from the public, had a child, and apparently tried to live a non-evil life for the rest of her days. Albert Fish. Albert Fish is known as the Brooklyn Vampire. But unlike the vampires we're used to seeing in movies, this guy was truly evil. In November of 1934, Grace Budd had been missing for 6 years already. She was just 10 years old when she vanished, and police had never made any headway on the investigation. But then one day, out of the blue, her mother received a very disturbing letter. The letter read something like, "Mrs. Budd, on June the 3rd, 1928, I brought you cheese and strawberries. We had lunch, your daughter sat in my lap, and I made up my mind there that I was going to eat her." And as it turned out, that's exactly what happened. A deckhand who had been doing work at the house met Grace and made his mind up that he would cook her in his oven. The letter marked the very end for the cannibal Albert Fish, since Grace's mother knew exactly who it was that had been at her house that day, 6 years ago. When the police finally tracked him down, Albert had already been doing a lot of killing. He admitted to starting his murder spree in New York City with young boys. He would lure them into his house and then torture them, often using a paddle studded with nails. This guy is truly evil, for the plain fact that most of his victims were children. Not only that, but he focused on disabled orphans and homeless black children. Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun was one of the evilest rulers from ancient times. While we may think of him today as an uneducated barbarian, the truth is that he was born into royalty. His uncles ruled the Hun Empire in the 420s and passed the throne on to him. He could speak and read multiple languages, he was taught military tactics, and he led a very privileged life. Then when he came to power, he became something of a monster. It's true that he negotiated a brief peace with the Romans, but he also killed his own brother to make sure nobody could contest his power. Then, in the spring of 450, Attila received a letter from Honoria, the sister of the Emperor of Western Rome. She sent him a ring and beseeched his help to get her out of an impending marriage to an aristocrat whom she didn't much like. At the time, Attila already had several wives, but he wanted his new bride so badly that he invaded Gaul and went on to wage 2 military campaigns just to get her. The evil ruler of the Huns met his horrible end on his wedding night. He was still in pursuit of Honoria when he married a woman named Ildico in the year 453. On his wedding night, he drank and feasted and then retired to his chambers. In the morning, he never came out. His guards eventually broke down the door and found him dead in his bed. He suffered a nosebleed while drunk and unconscious, and then choked to death on his own blood. Some historians believe it was actually his new wife who was found at his bedside who originated the whole thing. Vera Renzi. Vera Renzi was a very evil woman. She's known as the Black Widow, a terrible serial killer who lived between 1903 and 1960 in Romania. She confessed to poisoning at least 35 individuals throughout her life, including 2 of her husbands, several of her lovers, and her one son. Her son was poisoned with arsenic in the 1920s. Vera is extremely mysterious. Nobody has actually been able to find any legitimate sources that speak about her murders, as in no official government documents from Romania. And yet the story of Vera's evil killing spree has been around for at least 100 years. It's said that her mother died when she was just 13. She had numerous boyfriends, all of whom were way older than her. She was also described as jealous and suspicious in nature. Her first marriage ended when she suspected that her husband Lorenzo was unfaithful. She poisoned his dinner wine without ever confronting him. Then she became suspicious of her second husband and murdered him too. She murdered most of the men she had affairs with afterward, and in the end was finally caught after killing a bank officer who had been cheating on his wife with Vera. When the police investigated her house, they found a cellar beneath the floor with 35 coffins inside, and in the center was a single red armchair that she allegedly lounged in while drinking wine and reminiscing about all the men she had killed. Caligula. Caligula was the most sadistic Roman emperor ever. He ruled Rome for 4 years, mocking the Senate, draining the treasury, and having his own private party. Even all these years later, the name Caligula is still synonymous with insanity, sadism, and perversion. The problem with Caligula is that, according to his biographer Suetonius, he thought he was a god. He believed that he had the divine right to do anything he wanted to anybody. One of his favorite things to do was sleep with the wives of his officials, either consensually or by force, and then laugh about it in front of them. He also went to bed with his sisters. He confiscated people's houses for fun, and one day, when there were no criminals available to feed to the animals at the circus, he had an entire group of spectators thrown in to make things more interesting. He didn't really do one specific thing that was evil. It was more about his attitude towards his fellow humans. He mocked, tortured, ridiculed, and bullied everyone he could while having affairs with everybody's wife. It's no wonder the people sworn to protect him, his own Praetorian Guard, eventually plotted and carried out his murder.
Deadly sea scorpion in China. Scientists in China recently discovered the fossilized remains of a terrifying monster from the sea. The creature once grew to over 3 feet in length and looked like a massive scorpion. It had an enlarged back limb covered in spines, just like a scorpion's tail, which it used to ensnare its prey. The creature, known simply as a sea scorpion, is part of the Mixopterid family of Eurypterids. They may look like our modern scorpions with huge front claws and an enlarged tail. However, these things lived millions of years ago, and they aren't even closely related to scorpions. In total, researchers uncovered 3 fossils of this very distinct predator. They believe it lurked in the shallow waters near what is today South China between 419 and 444 million years ago. What's truly fascinating is that even eons after prehistoric swimming scorpions of massive proportions ultimately went extinct, we still have the much smaller modern versions of scorpions today in almost every part of the planet. Life still managed to re-emerge in almost the same form. Mind you, a lot smaller and far less terrifying. The Turtle of Transylvania. In the Transylvania region of Romania, scientists made an incredible prehistoric discovery. They came across the fossilized remains of a species of ancient turtle that had survived the asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs. This amazing, never-before-seen Transylvanian turtle lived 70 million years ago and didn't fully go extinct until 57 million years ago. What makes this discovery particularly incredible? This timing means that even after the asteroid struck our planet and caused a mass extinction event, this turtle species survived and continued on unaffected. It wasn't that big, only about 7 inches long. However, this tiny but mighty reptile survived when the dinosaurs and other beasts of the Cretaceous period were dying off en masse. 75% of all species on Earth, along with 100% of non-avian dinosaurs, were wiped out by the 6-mile asteroid, but not the Transylvanian turtle. This discovery has led to an interesting new theory. The team published their findings in the Scientific Journal of Systematic Paleontology, saying they believed the turtle's survival had to do with proximity. They believe that because the turtle was so much further away from the impact site, it had a better chance of surviving. The asteroid hit Mexico, and this turtle lived in Eastern Europe. Certain species groups that died in America managed to barely scrape by in Europe because it was so far from ground zero, especially semi-aquatic creatures like turtles. Among the other amazing discoveries in Transylvania have been dwarf dinosaurs and giant flying pterosaurs. The whole area used to be an island in the middle of the Tethys Sea, and so it's abundant with rare monster fossils. The Tuatara. Scientists have discovered the most ancient reptile still living and breathing today. It's called the Tuatara, and all of its friends are long dead. This creepy reptile crawled out of the primordial goo about 190 million years ago and is still thriving in our world. It looks like a lizard, moves like a lizard, and even sunbathes and eats insects like a lizard. But considering how old the Tuatara is, it's not technically a lizard at all. It's a mysterious creature which belongs to a group of reptiles called Sphenodontia. The first of its kind spawned sometime around 230 million years ago, possibly even as far back as 259 million years ago. Scientists don't know exactly how many of these mysterious reptiles once lived on our planet. What they do know is that the Tuatara is the only one left. Paleontologist Tiago Simoes was involved with a team of researchers who recently studied the Tuatara fossil and learned of its exceptional lifespan. Tiago recently told reporters that he and his team don't know how the creature managed to stay alive for so long, especially since it hasn't really diversified since it originally evolved. In other words, it hasn't changed almost any part of itself in over 190 million years. And just like the turtle from Transylvania, it survived the extinction of the dinosaurs. In fact, it even migrated to New Zealand after the Great Extinction 66 million years ago. How or why it managed to do this, though, remains a mystery. These days, the Tuatara can only be found in New Zealand, but fossils have been discovered all the way on the other side of the world in Arizona. The creature probably once lived across huge parts of the Earth, and now has a tiny habitat on an island at the bottom of the world. The terrifying truth of the Velociraptor. The Velociraptor is one of the most misunderstood dinosaurs that ever existed. Paleontologists have uncovered fossils of these majestic creatures only in Central Asia and China. In North America and South America, they've discovered related species, cousins and distant relatives of the original Velociraptor, but not the velociraptors themselves, contrary to popular belief. Additionally, the Velociraptor looked nothing like how it's been portrayed in movies since the 90s. It wasn't a sly, prowling lizard with rough skin and demonic eyes. It was actually more like a giant turkey with bright feathers and a bad attitude. Another major misconception? The Velociraptor was less than half the size it was portrayed to be in the movie Jurassic Park. It's true that there were other, larger raptors like the Tuatara and the Deinonychus, but the real Velociraptor was only about 6 feet long from the tip of its tail to the point of its nose. Paleontologists call it a mid-sized feathered theropod, or a land eagle. But if there is one thing filmmakers did get right, it's that the Velociraptor was a true predator. Even though it was only the size of a miniature poodle, it was feisty and fast and had the brains to back it up. Experts describe the Velociraptor as a hybrid between a modern wolf and a cassowary, the ritualistically beheaded beast. Researchers discovered the remains of a gigantic crocodile that lived in China 3,000 years ago. They believe this monster had been ritualistically beheaded in a bizarre ceremony. Here's the full story. Experts came across the fossilized remains of 2 crocodilians in China, each of them killed between 3,000 and 3,400 years ago. Never before had such creatures been discovered, and researchers soon learned they belonged to an entirely new species. The species was likely driven to extinction by humans just a few hundred years ago, after being hunted mercilessly over several millennia. The species has been named Hanusuchus sinensis in honor of a poet from the 9th century. The truly bizarre part of all this is that the remains were found with extensive evidence of violence. They had obviously been killed by humans, but not for the purpose of eating. They had likely been beheaded, and researchers have assumed it was part of some bizarre ritual. This entirely unknown species, very similar to gharials, had probably been used in rituals for thousands of years, so frequently that they were hunted to extinction. What kind of ritual do you think involved sacrificing prehistoric crocodiles? Beasts over 19 feet long? I'd love to hear your theories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We've got lots more videos like these coming up. Ancient octopuses. A newly discovered fossil is suggesting octopuses were around before the dinosaurs. Scientists recently uncovered what they believe to be the oldest known ancestor of the octopus, a fossilized aquatic creature that lived 330 million years ago in Montana. Of course, this was during a time when Montana was completely covered with ocean. Believe it or not, most of modern Montana was once a shallow tropical ocean bay, the perfect habitat for octopuses. This wasn't a huge beast. It grew less than 6 inches and had 10 limbs, 2 more than modern octopuses. According to the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, the discovery has pushed the ancestry of the octopus back an extra 100 million years. It now looks like the octopus is one of the oldest things still alive on the planet. It came about long before dinosaurs ever evolved and survived every great extinction event since. This new octopus is a vampiropod. Not only is it an ancient ancestor of the octopus, but it's also the ancient ancestor of the vampire squid. It was named Silipsympodi bidini after President Joe Biden. I'm sure the president is quite flattered to have an ancient ancestor of the vampire squid named in his honor, don't you think? What would you name a new species if you could? Let me know in the comments below. Prehistoric birds. Near the Great Wall of China, researchers have discovered what has been described as a lost world of prehistoric birds. One of the newly discovered species had tiny peg-like teeth and a movable chin like a pincer. Another was a toothless bird that looked almost identical to its modern descendants. The team uncovered over 100 specimens just 80 miles from the western border of the Great Wall. These specimens lived around 120 million years ago, during the height of the age of the dinosaurs. Even more bizarre is that the bird fossils were found in an ancient graveyard at the archaeological site of Chiang Mai. There are too many specimens to delve into each one in great detail, but we can talk about the strangest of them all, the Brevidentavis. This ancient bird had a flexible, bony appendage at the tip of its lower jaw, which it used to hunt prey. It's what the professionals call an ornithuromorph bird with teeth. It had tiny fangs in its mouth and a bizarre dangly thing hanging off where its chin would be, if birds had chins. This dangly thing worked as a feeler to help find prey. The bird could actually feel through it, detecting any nearby creatures that it could eat. And finally, scientists found proof of the Archaeopteryx, what they believe was the first legitimate bird of 150 million years ago. It was a kind of bridge creature between predatory dinosaurs like velociraptors and more modern birds like your standard seagulls. Fossilized heart. For the first time in history, scientists can finally study the heart of a fish that lived around 119 million years ago. The fish, whose skeleton was found in Brazil, is called a Rhacolepis. It's the first time a fossilized heart has been discovered belonging to any prehistoric animal. This is incredible for a whole host of reasons. As you're probably already aware, fossils almost always consist only of vertebrates, bones, and the occasional footprint. This is the first time the soft tissue of a heart was found. Normally, all organic material decays immediately after death. Organs begin breaking down right away from bacterial interactions. That's why only the skeleton remains. But at the rare fossil deposit in Brazil, the Santana Formation, researchers uncovered fish with soft parts, pieces of stomachs, and even muscle tissue. The fish with the heart was found by researchers with the Brazilian Biosciences National Laboratory. The discovery was only possible by using X-ray tomography to scan the fish fossil while it was still stuck inside limestone rock. Next, the heart was put together slice by slice using special digital software. It was the same process used to reconstruct the preserved brain of an even older fish discovered in North America that was 300 million years old. Researchers haven't discovered much information about the heart just yet, but they are hoping that with more time, they'll be able to gain a deeper understanding of evolutionary patterns and the development of soft organs in prehistoric animals. Lizard in amber. Amber is a pretty fancy term for fossilized tree sap. You might remember amber from the plotline of the movie Jurassic Park. In it, they got their special dino DNA from a mosquito found frozen in amber. And while that's purely science fiction, creatures getting trapped in amber isn't. In fact, it happens every day. An insect is crawling in a tree, gets stuck in some sap, and that sap hardens to create amber. Scientists have already found plenty of preserved insects from the prehistoric days inside tough shells of sap. It's extremely unusual, however, to find an entire lizard trapped in a hunk of Burmese amber. This fantastic specimen once clung to the side of a tree in the forest during the era of both dinosaurs and dragonflies as big as your head buzzing in the sky. It was only a juvenile when it accidentally ran into a huge glob of tree sap and couldn't escape. Over 100 million years later, it's still in almost the exact same condition it was when it first got trapped. The team who studied the frozen lizard had to approach it as if the creature were still alive. Not only could they study the skeleton, but they could look at everything from its double eyelids to its trachea, thanks to its perfect preservation in the amber. Fossil within a fossil. The complete skeleton of a prehistoric marine reptile was found by paleontologists in southwestern China. It's a creature called an ichthyosaur, a prehistoric predator that cruised through the world's oceans during the Mesozoic era and hunted with incredible ferocity. This particular marine monster, which looked similar to a dolphin but with really sharp teeth, lived roughly 237 million years ago. But what makes it so fascinating is that when paleontologists looked inside of it, they found a second creature fossilized in its belly. After the ichthyosaur ate its last meal, it also took its last breath. The monster died and ultimately became a fossil, with another fossil in its stomach. As of right now, this is the biggest fossil that's ever been found in the stomach of a prehistoric marine reptile. It's become something of a revelation to paleontologists who previously thought ichthyosaurs only consumed small prey, things such as cephalopods. Now it seems they were eating much larger animals. The thing in its belly was once a thalattosaur, yet another marine predator even larger than modern humans. Just imagine making a find like this with modern creatures. The oldest Buddhist temple. The very first Buddhist temple ever constructed may have just been unearthed in northern Pakistan. The temple was discovered in the Swat Valley, which is part of the ancient Gandhara region that was conquered by Alexander the Great in the 3rd century BC. It was the arrival of the Greeks and Macedonians that spawned a unique mixture of Buddhist belief and Greek artwork. In other words, it was the merging of two very different worlds. You could see Buddhas with Greek columns. Based on what little evidence they have, archaeologists believe the temple was constructed in the middle of the 2nd century BC, when Gandhara was ruled by the Indo-Greek kingdom. But what's fascinating is that researchers found traces of an even older Buddhist temple underneath it, probably from the century before. What that means is that the older temple, which is almost beyond recognition because it's so badly damaged, was constructed just shortly after the death of the Buddha. It's believed he died around 483 BC. This discovery is like finding the very first church built after the death of Jesus Christ. It's shocking, but hasn't been 100% confirmed. All archaeologists know now, as they excavate the remains of the temple, is that it is very, very old. Who built it and why they chose this particular place is a complete mystery. The first shipyard. Marine archaeologists have made an unbelievable discovery off the coast of England. They have just identified a shipyard 8,000 years old, which they believe to be the first of its kind anywhere on the planet. They discovered a huge number of timber boards sitting on the floor of the ocean, which were likely once part of a platform. The submerged structure had almost definitely been part of a primitive port. The discovery is thanks to expert divers with the Maritime Archaeology Trust. They were searching along the submerged landscape at Boldnor Cliff, what was once a valley populated by Stone Age humans, but is now over 30 feet underwater. There are no less than 5 archaeological sites in this one region. This was once part of the landmass which connected the island of Great Britain to the continent of Europe. It was home to all kinds of Stone Age settlers who had to flee when the ocean levels rose and their homes were swallowed and submerged. But by far, the most interesting discovery has been that of the shipyard. DNA analysis of the wooden material proved it to be the oldest boat-building site ever discovered. And because the tide is constantly shifting, and what is visible at the bottom of the ocean is always changing, each year brings something new. The most recent season helped divers uncover over 60 pieces of trimmed timbers that had once been part of the shipyard. To have something dating back 8,000 years ago is impressive in itself, but to have remnants of wood used by ancient people dating back that much is almost a miracle. The first common currency. Archaeologists appear to finally agree on the first common currency used in Europe. As it turns out, the very first standardized form of currency used across the American continent 5,000 years ago came in 3 forms. People used rings, bangles, and the blades of axes as the earliest forms of cash. These things were standardized by both shape and weight and accepted as tangible currency anywhere goods could be purchased. At least this is what researchers at Leiden University have confirmed. The Dutch researchers looked at over 5,000 axe blades and rings from around the year 2150 to 1700 BC. That's around 450 years, with the artifacts being taken from Germany to Scandinavia. Researchers uncovered not just single objects, but whole hordes of these scraps that had been buried by people trying to protect their wealth. What the study found was that regardless of region or time, each axe blade and bangle were almost identical in weight, shape, and size. 70% of the rings weighed roughly 195 grams. It was a remarkable achievement by primitive humans, considering they didn't even have any proper measurement system to make their currency uniform. This displays one of the most significant advancements in human intellect in our history, and it was undoubtedly the first step towards a global economy. The Pessy Canoe. The Pessy Canoe is considered to be the oldest boat in the world. There could have been an older boat made, but if there was, scientists haven't found it yet. Carbon dating has placed the canoe as being crafted sometime between 8040 BC and 7510 BC. This was a time when human beings were still hunter-gatherers, not living in major settlements and preferring to wander around the land hunting and surviving. It was also around the time that humans learned how to make sharper and more intricate tools out of stone, specifically things like knives, arrowheads, and axes. The canoe was discovered during the construction of a motorway in the Netherlands back in 1955, near the village of Pessy. That's actually how it got its name. One of the local workers noticed it sticking out from the remnant of an old tree, and it was salvaged and brought to the University of Groningen. Once there, the Pessy Canoe was freeze-dried to keep it from deteriorating. The canoe is just about 10 feet long, carved in the shape of a small boat. It was undoubtedly used for floating around on lakes or down rivers, but probably not for the open ocean. We don't know which culture is responsible for its creation, or if it was used primarily as a fishing vessel. We do know it was made out of a single Scots pine log, the same type of wood used by later civilizations to create dugout canoes. But perhaps the biggest mystery is that a very similar canoe, the second oldest boat ever discovered, was found several thousand miles away near the Dufuna village of Nigeria. Nobody has ever been able to make a clear connection between the two, although they are nearly identical and made 2,000 years apart. That's amazing! Do you have any ideas about what the connection could be? Share your ideas in the comments. Babylonian Map of the World. For all you cartographer fans out there, let's take a look at the very first map ever made. It's the Babylonian Map of the World, drawn on a tablet and inscribed in cuneiform script. It shows Mesopotamia as being the entire world, with Babylon at its center. The middle area of the map is completely ringed by a waterway called the Salt Sea. The outer area, beyond the Salt Sea, is divided into 8 specific regions. Each of these regions is described on the same tablet as being a place of horrible monsters, mythical beasts, and great, powerful heroes. It seems that the Babylonians believed that once you crossed over the Great Salty Sea, you wound up in unknown lands of horror and mystery. It's all quite exciting and must have felt even more exciting for the ancient Mesopotamians. They believed themselves to be the center of the world, surrounded by gods and beasts and mythical lands. The map is not only proof of this fantasy world they lived in, but the first serious example of geography. Not every place appears to be in its correct position, but this is the earliest example of a map, created in Babylon around 3,000 years ago. What do you think it was like believing the world was riddled with monsters and mythical realms? Living in the past seems to have been quite scary. Let me know in the comments. The first ear surgery. The earliest evidence of ear surgery goes back 5,300 years. A team of researchers at the University of Valladolid in Spain discovered the very first known surgical operation performed on a person's ear. The discovery came from a human skull found at a dig site called the Dolmen of El Pendonis. Previous research showed that it was used as a funerary complex around the year 3800 BC, then continuously for about 800 years. Primitive humans used the site as a mass graveyard. When researchers took the skull out of the ground and decided to analyze it, they came across something unbelievable. The skull showed evidence of surgery. It looks like the patient, a woman around the age of 35, had a mastoidectomy. This is still a procedure done today to clean out the area in the skull behind a person's ear after it's become infected. If the infection isn't cleaned, a person can go deaf or die. This woman had the procedure done in both her ears. Whatever the infection was, it must have caused her incredible pain because the surgery would have been brutal. A doctor from the Stone Age used a primitive implement, probably made from flint, to puncture the skull and remove the infected cells. How did they even know what they were doing? Do you think this was ancient medicine or torture? Let me know in the comments. The first city. If you've ever laid in bed at night and wondered what the very first city on Earth was, I have some excellent news for you. The very first city that fits every official definition of a city is called Uruk, and it was first settled around the year 4500 BC in Mesopotamia. It's important to note that there were other settlements before Uruk. Jericho, Eridu, and Sidon were all inhabited before Uruk, but they never managed to reach the status of a city. Uruk was the first one to create a stable social hierarchy, a political structure, monumental architecture, and much more. Writing, literature, religion, specialized jobs, everything that makes a city happened here first. One or two of these things certainly happened in other places, but they all happened collectively in Uruk. This led to a massive population boom, towering walls to protect against invaders, and agricultural production along the outskirts of the city walls. We don't know how many people lived in Uruk, but most historians agree it was more than anywhere else in the ancient world at the time. Word of prosperity spread, and people from the country began moving to Uruk in droves until the city was practically bursting. Why do you think people were attracted to city life back in the day? Which do you prefer, the city or the country? Let me know in the comments below. The Blombos Cave Rock Art. The Blombos Cave is a limestone cavern in Africa where the earliest known prehistoric art was discovered. The cave is located about 300 feet from the ocean and 180 miles away from Cape Town. The prehistoric rock engravings that were uncovered in its dark chambers have been dated back to around the year 70,000 BC. The oldest piece consists of a pair of broken ochre rocks carved with abstract symbols and geometric patterns. Additionally, somebody made a necklace out of shells. The next oldest example of cave art is at the El Castillo Cave in Spain, where paintings were drawn 30,000 years later. The Blombos cave art also predates anything similar in Europe by roughly 50,000 years. Even more incredible is that archaeologists also found some of the oldest bone tools in Africa here. They uncovered implements crafted from polished animal bones that date back over 80,000 years. Humans weren't even real humans back then. Have you ever been to a cave with prehistoric art? What was your experience like? The Persian Cant. The Persian Cant was the world's first irrigation system in Iran and throughout other Middle Eastern regions thousands of years ago. The technique involved digging a very long tunnel through dry land to allow water stored in an underground aquifer to spill down into the soil, creating less hostile conditions. Many parts of ancient Persia were desolate, barren, and infertile. The only way to support a huge population and to continue thriving in their great cities was to invent the world's first method of irrigation. The way the Cant worked was by digging a well deep at the top of an elevation. They would dig until they hit the water table, then create an artificial water channel to carry the life-giving liquid down the slope to the land that needed to be irrigated. The water was then moved via a network of dams, gates, and other channels to be distributed as needed. This is amazing because the whole thing was powered by gravity and provided both drinking water and fresh crops for the Persians. It was ingenious, a truly brilliant invention that pushed humanity one big step forward. And even though the Persians were the first to do it, they weren't the only ones who figured it out. Today, there are tens of thousands of Cants, although under different names, preserved in about 35 countries. Pretty impressive, right? Tools older than man. Remember the old bone tools I told you about from Africa? The tools that were 80,000 years old? That's pretty significant. But did you know that the oldest tools ever found are 3.3 million years old? It's true. They're called the Lomekwi tools, and they were found at an excavation site in Kenya. It's especially amazing because nobody knows exactly what the tools were used for. What we know is that somebody, not a human though, as humans hadn't evolved yet, sat down and started chipping away at a rock. They chipped and shaped the rock until it fit snugly in their hand and could be used to prepare meat or crack open nuts. It was a technological advancement that predates humanity. The tools were discovered in a dried riverbed, a small collection of cutting instruments and hammers. They are so old that they beat the previous oldest tools by 700,000 years. Jason Lewis from Rutgers University says the discovery has challenged the idea that human characteristics evolved with us near our origins. By that he means the making of tools, the consumption of meat, and the invention of language. Because these tools are so old, it's clear some unknown distant human ancestors had figured out how to shape rocks to be useful. It happened way before us. Thanks for watching! What's the coolest world first that you saw today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. We've got lots more videos about amazing discoveries coming up.